joining today's SRAE National Evaluation webinar on using continuous quality improvement to refine programming during the pandemic. I'm Heather Zaveri. I'm the Deputy Project Director for the SRAE National Evaluation, and I'm excited to share our content with you. Our presenter today will be Annie Buonospino, who has presented to this group on prior webinars, also focused on continuous quality improvement. Before I hand it over to Annie, I want to run through a few housekeeping items related to using the WebEx platform. I want to note this is a different platform than we have used on prior webinars in this series on continuous quality improvement. So we want to make sure everyone knows how to use it. Within the WebEx platform, we hope everyone will join the discussion. If you would like to join the discussion, we're going to ask you to comment to us through the chat box. You can access that in the bottom right-hand corner of the WebEx screen. When you chat with us, you have several options of who you want to chat with. For any of the chats we have built into today's presentation, we're going to ask you to use the Everyone feature, so it goes to everyone on today's call. And then if you have any technical issues, we're going to ask you to send that message directly to the host so we can ensure that that gets addressed. Next slide. We will also give folks opportunities to participate during today's call verbally. Everybody is muted when they entered the webinar today. If you would like to speak up during the call, we'll just ask you to select the hand raise icon, which is in the bottom right-hand corner of your panel. If you raise your hand, we will be watching for that, and then we will unmute you and let you know when you are unmuted so you can make your comment. Also, at the end of today's webinar, we will be asking you to complete a brief feedback survey so we can get your thoughts on how the webinar goes. We appreciate your honest feedback, as your responses really help us to shape future offerings related to training and technical assistance. I also want to note that materials and the recording from today's webinar will be available. The recording will be available approximately 1 day after today's event using the same link as you used to enter today's event. We are also work to develop a recording and related materials from today's event, and once those are available, they will be posted on the Serene.com website underneath the resources tab. I think with that, I'm going to pass it to Annie for today's content. Take it away, Annie.
Thanks, Heather. So today, as Heather mentioned, we're going to focus on using CQI to refine your approach to delivering programming under the context of the pandemic. You may be delivering virtually right now. Some of you may be delivering in person, but still having to adapt to public health guidelines. But regardless of your circumstance, I think probably everyone has had to adapt in some way to this new context, new as of last spring. So we'll talk today about some ways to learn more about how your modified approach to program delivery is working and refine and improve upon it. Similar to with our past webinars, the content we share today does not reflect official policies for FISB, ACF, or Health and Human Services, so you're not required to implement any of the content that we share today, but we do hope you find it helpful. So Heather talked a bit about how you can participate. In addition to the opportunities that we're going to have to share via the chat box or verbally, we're going to start out the session with just a few polls. So we would encourage you to share your responses via the polls as well. And if you joined past webinars, Heather mentioned we're using a different platform today. So in this platform, the polls are going to look a little bit different, and you should see them open on the right-hand side of your screen under the participants. So our objectives for today, first, is for you to understand the ways to use the CQI approach to learn about and strengthen program implementation. And then secondly, to think about some ways to compare outcomes between pre-pandemic and current programming. So I mentioned we're going to start with a couple of polls. This is a long one, so I'm going to read through the options before we launch the poll. and then we'll give you some time to select the option that feels most appropriate for you. So as I mentioned, we do understand the programming has changed for everyone, and we're just interested in hearing what you all are doing currently to deliver SRAE programming. So the options are A, programming is all virtual, and this could look a lot of different ways. So maybe you're delivering live programming via Zoom, maybe you have pre-recorded videos that you're sharing with your participants. B, your programming is hybrid, so maybe you have some groups that are virtual and some that are in person, or alternatively, maybe you have some participants who are virtual and some who are in person. C is participants are in person, but facilitation occurs via live stream or pre-recorded video. So maybe as facilitator, you're not allowed into a classroom or into a group home that you're delivering into. D, programming is entirely in person, but your in-person facilitation has required adaptation. For instance, social distancing guidelines are in place. E is also programming is entirely in person, but you have not had to make adaptations. And then F is you're not currently delivering programming. And then if for some reason there's some option that we didn't consider on that list, we did include an other on there, so you can choose G, other. And so I think now that we've gone through those, we're ready to launch the poll. So Derek, if you could launch the poll. Derek, great, thank you, great. And we'll give about a minute to respond to that. So we're going to give about another 15 seconds to give everyone a chance to scan that list. Okay, so that's time. So maybe we can share the results. Okay, so it looks like there's a good mix. Most people seem to be doing a hybrid format, so maybe a little bit of in-person and virtual, followed by virtual, and then D, so programming in person but requiring some adaptation, and just a handful also not delivering programming at the moment. So definitely a mix of things that people are doing, which is fine because our presentation today is really mostly about the CQI approach overall, which is something that you can apply regardless of how you're delivering programming right now. So let's move on to just one more poll, and this one is about CQI overall, and that is how confident do you feel using CQI to adapt your programming in light of the pandemic? So Derek, if you could launch this poll, I think we could just give 45 seconds. And the options here are very confident. So maybe you've been doing this since the spring and you feel good about it. Confident, somewhat confident, or not confident. Okay, and we'll share the results for this one. So most people are feeling good about it, either confident, B, or somewhat confident. So for those of you who have been doing this for a while, I would encourage you, if your team have been at this, it would be great if you could share your experiences when we have those opportunities to do that during some of our group chats, because I think others may benefit from hearing from some of you about what you've learned about refining and adapting during this time. So thanks everybody for your responses to those polls. And so we're going to get started. So we understand all of you are using a curriculum that was most likely designed for normal in-person delivery. So prior to everything changing, you kind of had a more well-defined roadmap for how to deliver the program. Under this new context, there isn't really a roadmap for implementing in the same way. So your team is kind of building evidence for how to make this work well under your circumstances as you go. And the good thing is that CQI provides a really excellent process for helping you to do that, because it's about learning fast and iterating as you go. So we wanted to make sure that everyone is on the same page about what CQI is. And so you may remember this cycle from some of our past webinars. CQI is a process for identifying areas that you want to strengthen, understanding the challenges that's in the planning steps, and then moving on to strategy development, so where you develop solutions, testing those solutions, and assessing how they work, and then strengthening your practices based on what you learned, so implementing your new strategies. And that's a very high-level overview of the process. We've had some prior CQI webinars, as Heather mentioned at the start. So if it's helpful to have more foundational information on CQI, you can find some of those webinars on the Serene website. And I don't know that that is in our resource section. So I'm going to share a link to that in the chat so that you all have that. But today's conversation is focused more on how to apply this approach to the current context. So your goals in using CQI to build evidence for how to do this well are primarily to determine how to continue delivering your program well under this new context. But some other reasons why you want to be really intentional about documenting your lessons learned is because there might actually be some aspects of this, however you're delivering your program right now, that you want to retain post-pandemic. And so it's important to document your insights about how those worked well. So for example, let's say you shifted to virtual delivery, so you also moved your data collection online. Maybe you're using SurveyMonkey to administer your satisfaction survey, and you find out that's actually much easier than doing it via paper survey. So you're going to keep that when you go back to normal. So you want to make sure you've documented what you've learned about doing that well, so that you have that down. And then the third goal is that you might have opportunities to share with other grantees or other providers about how to do this well and how to deliver well in your modified format. So we're dividing today's conversation into 3 overarching areas that you'll want to focus on when considering how to improve your approach, and that's implementation, participant experience, and outcomes. So some of the questions that you could be asking for implementation is, how are our facilitators or other frontline staff adapting their delivery? With participant experience, do youth and families find the new format engaging? And outcomes, so how does quality and engagement differ between your pre-pandemic program and your modified program? So let's start with implementation and how are facilitators adapting delivery? So as I'm sure many of you know, facilitators are a great source of information for building evidence about what works well when it comes to modified delivery. Some of the modifications that you make to your delivery may have been pre-planned. So you may have adapted an in-person activity to a virtual setting before you begin delivering your program if you're delivering virtually. And of course you want your facilitators' feedback on how that went, but they're also a very good source for new ideas on how to improve as they're delivering. So they may make modifications over the course of the program to enhance their delivery. And it's helpful to encourage your facilitators to experiment with those sorts of minor modifications, so those that wouldn't necessarily alter the core components of the program. And they're likely doing that anyway, but the key is to make sure that they're documenting what they learn about that. So if you have a CQI team, or if you have a few staff who really focus on CQI for your program, your facilitators kind of become the on-the-ground co-investigators into what works well. And so you want to have a system in place for them to capture what they did so that you can begin to log what works well and reflect back on that. So some of the things they should document, obviously noting the reason for the modification that they made. So for example, if you're delivering virtually, maybe your facilitator notices that students get sluggish more quickly online and start to disengage. So that's the challenge, and you want them to note that. They should also include a description of the modification or what they tried to address that problem. So let's say they decide to add some energizers throughout the program to keep students engaged. Maybe they had students get up and move around or do jumping jacks midway through. And then an assessment of effectiveness. So what happened? Did it help, or did the facilitator notice that when kids came back, they were focused again? And to do this documenting, if you're implementing a curriculum that comes with a fidelity log, you could have facilitators make notes on that fidelity log just by adding items on the log. Or you could create your own tracker, like something we have showing right here. I've also heard of some teams that will bring together their facilitators like for weekly meetings to share what they've tried, which is really helpful for cross-learning. But you also just want to make sure that somebody is writing that down so that you have that documented in terms of what worked and also what didn't work. So I'll just read through the example of the log that we have here. The first example is showing what we just went through. So students are losing energy. Facilitator had everyone get up after 30 minutes and move around. Felt like this worked really well. So we deem this a successful strategy. So this is one that we would want to keep and share with the other facilitators so they could use this in their sessions. But it's also a good idea to have your staff track the modifications that weren't successful. So if we read through the second example in this log, the challenge is that students were talking over each other. They weren't really sure in Zoom when it was their turn to talk. So facilitator instructed the students to use the hand raise feature, as we're doing today, to have students speak. And their assessment of this strategy was that it did help to address the challenge and that they weren't talking over each other anymore, but also felt like it stifled the conversation. So they know that this is a strategy that wasn't worth keeping. So that's also helpful to have down and to remember because, again, you're keeping a log about how to deliver the program effectively. And so it's good to remember that this is an outstanding challenge, both so that you can come back to it if it continues to be a challenge, but also to remember what you've already tried and what didn't work. So those were some thoughts to consider about how you can draw on staff to help you refine and improve. We also wanted to focus on participants and families. So how are they experiencing your program? You want to assess whether you were able to recreate an engaging and quality program in your new context, whether that's online or modified in person or a mix of those two. And one of the best ways to assess this is through observation, which many of you likely do already, either for fidelity or quality. But if you don't do these types of observations, it can be a really useful tool for improvement purposes as well, because it's an opportunity for you to see what about your modified approach seems to be working and where you felt the energy was low or the content wasn't being well communicated or any other issues or obstacles that might be getting in the way of really delivering a quality program. So we're going to start with virtual programming. If you're delivering virtually and you're doing an observation of a session, obviously you would want to do an overall assessment of the quality of the session, but some of the things that are specific to virtual that you might look for. First, to what extent are participants engaging with features that are designed to encourage communication? So for example, if you want them to use the chat box, are they engaging with you there? Are they responding to the polls that you've put in your session? These are additional measures of engagement in the virtual setting that obviously wouldn't apply to the in-person session. So you can use that information to further understand and kind of supplement your understanding about how participants are reacting to your program. Also, did they feel comfortable using the platform, or did it seem like they weren't sure how to engage with you? Were they having trouble figuring out how to participate? So it might seem like by this point, most people would know how to use Zoom, but if they're not familiar with your platform, that's really great formative feedback to gather because you might need to step back and take the time to walk them through the platform because otherwise the unfamiliarity could get in the way of engagement. Another thing to watch for is technology disruptions, either with the facilitator or any of the students. And this is important both because you want to know whether students missed out on content, but also just to note the tech issues that you would need to follow up with to resolve the issue. So if you're already doing fidelity observations, you could just consider adding those types of items to your current observation template. In terms of in-person groups, if you're delivering in person, maybe the facilitator is delivering virtually and you're live streaming, or you're working under these new circumstances, so you still had to adapt your program or modify your program in some ways. It's helpful to consider what modifications you made to work in the new environment and try to be intentional about observing how they're working. So for example, let's say due to public health guidelines, we had to lower our normal group size. Maybe we usually serve 20 to 25 students, and now it's closer to 8 students per group. It's good to do an observation to note the dynamic of the group now that you've had fewer students. So do lessons still work well with fewer students? Do the students still seem engaged, both with each other and with the facilitator? And in the research section of this PowerPoint, I included a few templates, which I believe we shared in one of our past webinars this summer. But I find these to be really helpful for these types of observations to really try to understand how the modified delivery is working. And again, this would just supplement any template that you were already using for fidelity observations. And then, of course, for live streaming, if your facilitator is not actually with the students, similar to the virtual, you would want to note technology disruptions so that you could follow up on all those. And then to the last point here, as you may toggle back and forth quite a bit in the ways the lessons are delivered, it's a good idea to have a place on your observation form to note the delivery mode. So whether it was all virtual or some kids were virtual and some were in person or all were in person, because that's helpful in understanding the context of what you were observing when you return to that information. So as you're observing sessions, you'll want to note challenges that you observe and then respond with either outstanding questions or some of the ideas that are coming up with for you to address the challenge. So this is an example of some notes that we might jot down on a template as we're observing a session. So in the first example, this is for a virtual program. And the challenge we noticed is that some students aren't participating in the session. So here, we're going to note questions to investigate further, because there are many reasons why students might not be participating in the session or engaging with us. It could be that they're having tech troubles. It could be that they have distractions in their home environment, or maybe they don't have a private place to engage with the program, or it could just be a lack of interest, or they don't feel like the activities are working well. Those are all challenges that would merit different responses. And so it's kind of hard to design a solution to address that issue if we don't know what's driving the lack of participation. So we're going to come back to that question in a moment. But I just wanted to look at the last example in the log too. So in this case, let's imagine we're observing an in-person group, but one that has still required some modifications. So we've had to eliminate some of our interactive portions of the lesson due to some of these social distancing guidelines. And our challenge here is that we observe low energy in the group. And we think this may be because we took out some of these interactive activities. So in this case, we have a hunch as to what the problem is, which is that our current modified activities aren't engaging enough. So we'll brainstorm with our team and decide maybe in this circumstance that a next step is to bring in technology to try to recreate interactivity. So for example, let's say we have students use their phones in the classroom to engage with Kahoot, which is a web-based quiz program that I know a lot of grantees have used. And we're going to integrate some competitions into our lessons to try to recreate some of that interactivity. So that's our idea. And the next step for us would be to test that out and then collect some feedback from facilitators and students about what they thought about it. So for our open questions that we note on our observations, those are the areas that we feel like we need to investigate more, so beyond what we were able to observe. And so we'll follow up on the question from our log, which is that we have a group of students in our virtual program who really aren't participating. And so we want to try to understand what their needs are or what their obstacles might be to participating. So one way to get that information is through a survey. In this example, we could explain to our students that we're trying to improve our virtual experience. We want to understand their circumstances. And we can send them a survey asking about some of their needs. So things like, how are you connecting? Are you using a computer or are you on your phone? How reliable is your connection? What is your learning environment like at home? So for instance, do you have a private place to engage in the program? And again, in the resource section of our slides, we link to a sample survey that someone else created, but I think it's really great for these types of questions in terms of assessing your students' needs. So that's a resource that you can check out if that would be useful to you. So we've been talking a lot about observations because they can be a really useful tool. But just wanted to touch on some other useful and low-burden sources for assessing participant experience in your modified program. So as many of you know, probably one of the best ways to get information on how to improve is to ask the young people in your program. So if you already have an existing post-program satisfaction survey, or maybe you do a focus group at the end of each year group, that's a really great opportunity to add on questions that are specific to your modified format to understand what they liked about it and what they would improve. So for our virtual programming, in addition to the usual questions that we would ask on the satisfaction survey, we could ask for specific feedback about the virtual format. So what lessons or engagement strategies worked for them in this format and which didn't. If you're hybrid, you actually have a unique opportunity to ask about their preferences. So which format did they like better, or what did they like or what didn't they like about each of those formats. That would be in the circumstance if students are experiencing both in-person and virtual. But that's a survey or focus group that would come after you conclude the group, because I'm assuming many of you do your satisfaction surveys at the conclusion of a group. So you're not necessarily going to do a lengthy survey or a focus group after every session you run. So to get feedback that you're able to apply right away and refine as you're delivering the program, you can use polling or short exit tickets to gather ongoing feedback after each lesson. And so with a virtual program, you have the opportunity to use polling either via your platform's built-in functionality, as we're doing right here with WebEx, or an outside program like Menti, or Poll Everywhere, where you can actually ask just 1 to 2 questions at the end of every session to gather quick feedback from young people. So for example, and you can build this into your routine of your program, just what's one thing that worked today, what's one thing that didn't work today. The advantage of using built-in functionality with Zoom, for instance, is that it's simpler, so the youth don't actually have to go anywhere to engage with it. The benefit of using an outside polling program like Menti is that it has more question options, so you can ask those open-ended type questions and have a little bit more flexibility with your format. And so we also link to some resources for how you can do polls in platforms like Zoom and Google Meet, as well as Menti and Poll Everywhere. And if you're in person, you can do the same thing using exit tickets, which are tools that are often used by teachers to do a learning check after a lesson. These are basically like 1 to 2 question surveys, or kind of like paper versions of polls. And so the information that you collect from exit tickets or polls can be used to directly feed into refinements in your next session. And that's the benefit of having that immediate feedback. And I didn't actually include a resource in the resource section about exit tickets, but I'm going to share a link that I think gives a pretty good overview of that in the chat. Okay, so a final key source for assessing participant engagement that you can use to gather some kind of low burden information quickly is web analytics if you're delivering virtually. So these are very low burden because they're tracked automatically when you run your sessions. So if you're doing live delivery through something like Zoom, most platforms track basic analytics about things like attendance and retention, but also engagement to some extent. So Zoom has a poll engagement report that will show you the percentage of the participants in your meeting who responded to your poll. If you're delivering pre-recorded, maybe you're using YouTube to share pre-recorded videos with young people in your program, there's a wide range of analytics that could be of use to your team for that, including how long people watched your video, the percentage of the video that they watched, and when they watched it after you posted. So those can be really useful stats to get feedback on next steps. So do you need to shorten your video because you're losing students? Does it make a difference what time you post your video in terms of when the students watch it? That can be really good formative feedback because you can use information in real time to shape your approach. And if you feel like your viewers are dropping off after just a certain number of minutes, they can just be like a really good flags for issues to probe more on. So sometimes web analytics can feel a little bit limiting because a lot of times they're aggregate level, but they also flag issues for you. So the metrics alone might not tell you what the issue is, but they'll tell you that there's a problem, and then you can follow up with that by talking to your students about what's not working with them, for instance, with the videos. So that was a lot of information, and we just wanted to have a chat to hear from all of you about some of the real-time information that you have collected over the course of your program to shape your approach as you go. And especially, what type of information have you collected that you feel like has been most helpful to you for understanding either participant experience or for understanding facilitator experiences? So you can either use the chat, or if you want to share verbally, we encourage that because we're able to do that here. And again, if you want to share verbally, you should use the hand raise button so we can unmute you. Okay, Adam, I'm going to, actually, Amy, could you unmute Adam? Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adam Simmons. I'm from Healthy Visions in Cincinnati, Ohio. Can you all hear me okay?
Thanks, Adam. We can. Go ahead.
Awesome. One thing that we have found out, and I think this has been some information that's been helpful for teachers, is that using the polls in real time, we can ask information about how students feel comfortable or safe in their environments, whether it's at school or at home, but they're able to answer them anonymously, and they can figure out a percentage of that class. So if we're talking about boundaries and being able to reach out to a trusted adult, we can simply follow up during that lesson. How many of you feel comfortable or feel safe, or that you would feel heard if you were to reach out to your teachers? And we'll get some very surprising numbers, and this can help teachers be more aware of their classrooms. So that's been a piece of information that's been helpful for us and our teachers.
Thanks, Adam. That's great. Yeah, so they can be helpful not just for assessing your program, but also for kind of supplementing the messaging that you're delivering. Anyone else? Oh, go ahead.
Absolutely. It's been really helpful for several of them.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing. And I'm going to take a look at the chat too. So we've used virtual programming for all of our sites and has went well. Great. Has anyone else found anything to be particularly helpful to get feedback about your program? So student satisfaction surveys through the use of an emoji face ranking system with the option to write in. Yeah, so that also sounds like kind of, Kelsey, that sounds like maybe a quick poll that you did to see how the session went for them. And through asking the student, of course. That's always the most direct way to get information. So we noticed that for our in-person programming, removing activities, many students were engaged. Yeah, Kahoot. Thanks for bringing it up, Tiffany. I was going to mention that in an example later on in the session as well. I've heard of a lot of grantees using Kahoot. It may or may not work for everyone, but it does seem like something that's worked for a lot of teams in enhancing engagement. Okay, well, thank you for everyone who shared. And we are going to move on to our last section, which is focusing on outcomes. So we've looked a bit about how staff are adapting their programming and how participants are experiencing the adapted program. The last overarching question that we wanted to focus on is about outcomes. So unlike the prior two questions that were focused more on implementation and how it's going, this is really looking at the end result of your modified program. So getting at, you're working under a new context. How well has your team been able to recreate the experience that you were delivering before? Or even are there things that actually work better with this format or pieces that you might maintain? So some of the data that you could examine based on what your team is collecting to compare both pre pre-pandemic delivery, and then what you're doing right now with your modified format. First is your performance measures. So you could look at some metrics that you collect related to session attendance and participant engagement. We put youth behaviors through entry and exit surveys here. You might not be able to compare to pre-pandemic, but if you have a hybrid format, which it looks like in that early poll that a lot of you are doing, both in-person and virtual, then you can compare survey results across those formats. It is important to note that this wouldn't be a rigorous study because there could be a lot of other factors driving those differences in the survey results. But if your virtual sessions or your in-person sessions were either consistently higher or lower, for example, in what you're seeing on your surveys, then that's something that you could explore further. You can also look at participant ratings on your satisfaction surveys if you do student satisfaction surveys, observation ratings if you do them, and fidelity logs. Again, if your facilitators complete logs after the sessions to respond to the extent to which they implemented activities as part of the curriculum, then that's something that you could compare in terms of how well they were doing that prior to the pandemic and with your modified delivery. So some of the questions that you could be asking, what seems to work well in your new format? So maybe you're delivering virtually and attendance is actually higher for a certain population that you had trouble reaching in the past. Or was there anything that was consistently lower? Was there anything that was surprising? So maybe you anticipated that engagement might be more difficult in a virtual format, but it actually wasn't. That would be something that would be interesting to explore more. So these are good questions both for reflection on thinking about what worked and what didn't, as well as to kind of direct those future types of inquiries where you might want to follow up with a focus group and understand a little bit more about what you're seeing in your outcomes. And then to the last point, let's say you identify a challenge from examining your outcomes. So maybe attendance is much lower in your new format. This is just listing some areas to look for ideas to try to address that challenge. So again, one of the best places to turn for ideas is to your facilitators or to participants. They're the ones who are actually experiencing the program and can respond to what might work better for them. There are also useful activities to facilitate creative brainstorming with staff, like how might we prompt? And I linked to a brainstorming resource in the resource section if that's useful. Also, if there's interest, we're happy to share more activities you could consider in office hours during our post-webinar office hours if we have one. And then other providers. So there's a network of grantees who are delivering in some similar circumstances. So what have they tried that has worked well? So we're going to just walk through a quick example before we wrap up. Let's say that we see that our participant satisfaction survey ratings related to engagement and satisfaction with our virtual sessions are consistently lower than they were for our in-person sessions that we were running before the pandemic. So we're going to flag that as an issue, and we'll brainstorm causes of the problem. So maybe we start by getting our staff together to think through what the potential causes could be. We could also look at any data we collected over the course of delivering the virtual program that might be useful. So maybe we look at any observations that were done and see what was noted that might give clues to engagement concerns. And then we'll talk to past participants of virtual groups to learn more about what some of the challenges might have been. So from that, we can start generating ideas. So we might learn from talking to a few program alumni who participated in our virtual program that they just didn't think the activities translated very well online. So I mentioned Kahoot earlier, and it sounds like some of you have used it. Again, it's a web-based program that allows you to run quizzes and competitions. So we're going to try using that in our program to see if that enhances engagement with the youth in our virtual program. So if you remember our CQI cycle, we're going to pilot this in one session to see how it works and try to work out any issues before we bring it to all of our other sessions. And as part of the pilot, we'll collect some feedback from students and facilitators about how it worked and whether they liked it, whether it helped them to engage with the material more. And then assuming the feedback was promising, we could either test it out with a different group, or if we feel good about it, we can make a decision to implement it in all of our groups and train all of our facilitators on how to do this effectively based on what we learned in the pilot. And then we'll continue to monitor our satisfaction survey results at the end of each of our virtual groups and see whether students find the sessions to be more engaging in this new format with this new feature now that we're using Kahoot. Sorry, I didn't advance the slides, but these are the final steps. And then we'll end with 6. We'll continue to look and have we increased the engagement in our sessions. So we just wanted to end with one more group chat because I had mentioned earlier on in the webinar that one of the best ways to learn about what works is from your peers. So I thought we could take the opportunity, as we have a lot of people in the session right now, to share a strategy that has worked really well for you, either in a virtual format or a hybrid format that you have, or altered in-person approach. And again, similar to last time, you can either type it into the chat, or if you feel comfortable sharing verbally, we would encourage you to do that. We'd really love to hear from some teams about what has worked well. Okay, so Madeline tried setting the bar high by encouraging unmuting to talk, and then chat as a secondary option. I think that's a great strategy. Yeah, it does take a lot too. So we saw that 1 to 2 students would be brave and unmute, and many others preferred the chat box. The chat box has definitely been the preferred method in a lot of meetings recently. And Calvin, working with teachers and administrators has worked well. We have our meetings with them to assess the program. Definitely, so maintaining strong partnerships. Anyone else have any strategies? Adam, requiring each student to have personal computers with cameras on definitely makes a difference to be able to see people. And doing polls, creating PowerPoints to go along with each session, with visuals to help people follow along with the sessions. The direct chat option, yes, I've heard that from a lot of other teams that users are really liking the chat box to share thoughts. And a lot of skits for in-person programming, definitely to maintain engagement. Anyone else want to share verbally with the group something that's worked really well? Virtual incentives. I've also heard that from other teams. Yeah, and so Madeline also allowed students to message us individually on Zoom if they want to share private responses with other students. That's a great tip as well. Lauren, participants using the chat box more. So yeah, it sounds like the chat box has been a saving grace in all of this. And Adam has a question for those of you who are using virtual incentives. Who has successfully used virtual incentives and can share? So Amazon gift cards. Grubhub gift cards. Those are very applicable right now. Great, so it sounds like a lot of people are using Amazon and food delivery gift cards, which are what it seems like everyone wants at the moment. Okay, well, thanks everyone for sharing. Hopefully it's helpful to see what some of your peers have used to try to make this programming work. I know it's you're the ones who are actually on the ground doing this work, so I appreciate everyone being willing to share that with us. And you can feel free to continue sharing ideas in the chat, but we are going to move on to first just the Q&A. Does anyone have any questions about anything that we shared today that we can follow up on? Kahoot, because we talked a lot about Kahoot today. I can, so it's a web-based program and you can run these quiz-based competitions, but are there any teams who have used Kahoot who could kind of speak to what it is? Because I do think it sounds like that's been a promising strategy, so that might be helpful to hear. Adam, your hand is still raised. I don't know if you just didn't unraise it, but it sounds like you've used Kahoot, so if you'd be willing to share with Deborah what Kahoot is and how you've used it, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Deborah, so essentially Kahoot is an online quiz platform where you can make your own quizzes, but it also, if you purchase some of their different premium options, you can include polling, which would be a non-competitive ability to ask questions. You can also make it to where they can write in answers. There's a puzzle option, which would require them to place answers in the correct order, as well as the standard quiz options, which can include true and false, or up to 4 different answers. You can add graphics in there. You can track the progress. You can also have students go through the Kahoots at their own time and energy whenever they have, they can be an assignment essentially. So it's extremely versatile. And there's analytics that go along with each quiz or opportunity that they do, assignment that they do.
Thank you so much. So any short docs or links on these tips and strategies for CQI that can be shared with facilitators? So I'm going to go over after this Q&A some of the resources that we have in the resource slide. But if there's more that you're interested in, we can certainly share some more foundational information about CQI as well, if that would be helpful. So maybe after I go through the resources, Danita, if I pronounced your name correctly, feel free to ask again if there's anything specific that might be helpful that we could share with you. And yes, this will be available on the Serene website. So we have another question here. What programs and platforms have people used for polling outside of presentation software? Is that somebody that can anyone speak to that? Selena, it sounds like you're asking when you say outside of presentation software, you mean not the built-in functionality. So if that's the case, then yeah, some of the programs I mentioned are Menti and Poll Everywhere. We use Menti quite a bit, and I do include a link to that on the resources slide. You can use a free version, and so that's part of what works so great about it. And it also just has a lot of different question types. So if you're feeling limited by what's available for your Zoom built-in polling, then that's an option that you can use. The second one is called Poll Everywhere, and that's free up to a point. So that might be less useful, but it's very versatile. Are we able to give electronic gift cards if the group is Title V? Can it come from an organization? Can anyone respond to their use of electronic gift cards to help respond to Charmaine? So the question is, are we able to give electronic gift cards if the group is Title V? Can it come from our organization, or does it need to come from the school? That is not a question that I can respond to, but if anybody has a response to that, please put it in the chat. Okay, and then we also had a question earlier about the service learning component. So how does the service learning component work virtually? Does anyone on the call have any experience with that, and would you be willing to share, especially verbally? I think that would be great. So thanks to everyone for your responses. So could someone unmute Lena? Go ahead, you're unmuted.
Hi, yes. We haven't had any experience with this virtually, but we have had some other grantees experience this, and what they do is have Zoom sessions for the planning part of the service learning project, and then the actual execution of it will be done in person. And what they have planned to do are things like supply drop-offs at a certain location, or writing care cards to medical workers. And so they've done kind of a hybrid, with most of it being online for the planning portion.
Great, thanks so much for sharing, appreciate that. Okay, so I think that was all of our questions. I am going to move on to our resources slide, which I've been referencing. Just quickly run through what we have. So we do have a background primer on a guide to road testing. So road testing is basically what we talk about doing a pilot of some of these strategies that you might be trying. I had mentioned these observation templates. So one of them is a journey map that I find kind of helpful, as well as a reflection grid to think about what went well with your modified approach. The sample survey questions to understand participants' virtual context. And then just more on web analytics that might help to supplement your learning for some of the more common platforms that sounds like grantees are using. Some options for getting feedback via polling. And then I mentioned that tips on brainstorming new ideas if you're having a session with your staff and want to think about how to come up with some creative ideas for overcoming challenges. So this will be posted on the Serene website, so you can access those links there. Next steps, if you want to request individual support, you're free to use the Rita email account, which we will be monitoring and get back to you. And then I had mentioned earlier that there may be a forthcoming office hours to probe a little bit deeper in this topic. And I also just wanted to highlight, to wrap up the conversation on virtual gift cards, which there were a lot of great responses to that. I think the overall guidance there would be to consult with your federal project officer prior to purchasing virtual gift cards as incentives. So just to loop back to that question. Okay, so for our last slide, again, feel free to send any questions, comments, concerns to our mailbox. When you log off the session, you should get a survey, and we would certainly appreciate your feedback on the session. And hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon and Happy New Year. Thanks so much for attending.